Hi bakers, today we're making one of my absolute favorite pies of all time, apple crumble pie. Think classic apple pie, but instead of a top crust, we're piling a thick, buttery brown sugar crumble on top. This is the definition of fall comfort, and you don't need to fuss with a decorative pie crust on top. Homemade pie is hands down my favorite dessert, and if you've made my classic apple pie before, this one will feel very familiar. Same warm spices, same mountain of apples, but easier thanks to that crumble topping. Let's start with the crust. We're using an all butter pie crust. This recipe makes just one crust. It's buttery, flaky, and sturdy enough to hold all of those juicy apples. I have a big mixing bowl here, and I'm going to combine all-purpose flour with a touch of sugar and salt, and then we'll add some cold cubed butter. Cold butter is key to a flaky pie crust. As the cold butter melts in the oven, it releases steam, creating tiny air pockets that form those tender, crisp layers. If the butter is too warm, it blends into the flour and the crust turns out dense instead of flaky. Let's cut this butter in with a pastry cutter, or you can use a food processor for this step. Cut it in until the mixture resembles coarse crumbs. This is going to take about a minute or two of mixing together. And when I'm cutting in this butter, I'm turning my wrist just a little bit every time to make sure that we're really cutting down into those chunks of butter. I like to do this by hand because I want to avoid over mixing. If you are using a food processor, just keep a close eye on it. You're cutting in the butter until it resembles like pea-sized crumbles that are coated in flour. Okay, this looks great. The butter has broken down and it's coated in flour. Now we'll add ice cold water. Pour it in slowly and we will stir it in. And this might take a minute or two of mixing. And I have extra ice water on hand in case the dough is a little dry, and sometimes it is. So sometimes we need to add a little bit more ice cold water. I'm going to add a little bit more water, 1 tablespoon at a time. We're looking for a shaggy dough, one that doesn't have a ton of dry bits of flour and one that's not overly sticky. All right, this dough looks great. It's shaggy, and now we can form it together with our hands. And we're going to bring the dough together into a ball, and then we will flatten it into a 1-inch thick disc and chill it in the refrigerator for 1 to 2 hours. We'll wrap this dough up tightly and get it in the refrigerator. And during that time, it's going to firm up and set shape, and then we can work on our crumble topping. The crumble topping is super easy, and it's the star of the show. We need brown sugar, flour, cinnamon, some walnuts, and you can skip the nuts if you'd like, or you can replace with chopped pecans. Let's mix these together, and then we'll add the melted butter, which will bring it all together. All very basic pantry ingredients that transform into something amazing once baked. Melted butter. And this topping will look extra crumbly, and that's exactly what you're going for. You don't want to over mix it so it turns into a paste. You want it to stay crumbly. When you're mixing the crumble ingredients together, it should hold the little clumps, and that's the perfect texture. Chill the topping too so these crumbles hold shape in the oven. Next, we're going to roll out the chilled pie dough. All right, let's lightly flour our work surface, lightly flour the dough, and we will also lightly flour our rolling pin. Roll this chilled dough out into a disc that's about 12 inches in diameter, and give the dough a quarter turn after every few rolls to make sure it's not sticking on the bottom. After a few turns, I like to flip it over and make sure it's definitely not sticking. When you're rolling, don't get nervous about visible specks of butter in the dough. They're perfectly normal and expected. You're rolling this dough out until it's about 1/8 of an inch thick, which again is about 12 inches in diameter. Let me flip it one more time. That top was nice and floured, so I know it won't stick. All right, this looks great. And now we're going to transfer it to our 9-inch pie dish. So I'm going to use the rolling pin to help me. Roll it back onto the rolling pin. Let's grab our pie dish and unroll it right on top. I'm going to center it up to make sure it's even on all sides. And rolling it out to be 12 inches in diameter gives us enough room to work with on the edges to flute them, to make that really pretty pie crust edge. And I'm tucking it in to make sure it's smooth and that there are no gaps of air between the crust and the pie dish. I have another tip. Make sure that the pie dish you are using is around 1.5 to 2 inches deep so it can handle all of that tall apple pie filling. It doesn't look like there's too much excess dough around these edges. This one side looks a little long. I want to make sure I have just enough so I can flute these edges. To get started on fluting the edges, I'm rolling these edges back in towards the center so we have a nice thick crust. There you go. All right, now I'm going to flatten them out with my 2 hands to make sure that it's an even circle. Sometimes it can get a little lopsided. This looks nice. Fluting the edges will give the pie that beautiful scalloped shape. To flute the edges, use the knuckle on your index finger on one hand and your thumb and your other index finger, and we're going to pinch these edges together to create that scalloped look around the edges. This is really easy once you get the hang of it, and it gives your pie that classic homemade look. Now let's brush these edges with egg wash, and this is going to give the crust that beautiful golden sheen. And an egg wash is just an egg mixed with a little milk. And then we use a pastry brush to brush these edges. Now for the filling. This is the easiest part. It's such a simple classic mix. Apples, lemon juice, sugar, flour, spices, and a bit of vanilla for extra flavor. Flour is going to thicken our filling. Got lemon juice, which will brighten up the flavor so the filling doesn't taste flat, and lots of spices here. Splash of vanilla for even more flavor. And let's carefully stir these all together. Use your biggest mixing bowl. I always use a variety of apples for the best flavor. A tart apple like Granny Smith mixed with a sweeter one like Honeycrisp, Fuji, or Pink Lady. That balance of tart and sweet gives you that perfect bite, not too sugary and not too flat. And here's something that I've learned after testing what feels like hundreds of apple pies. Slice your apples evenly, about 1/4 inch thick. Too thin and the apples will collapse into applesauce. Too thick and they stay crunchy. Even slices mean tender apples with just the right amount of bite. Mix everything together and then we will spoon this filling into the chilled crust. Spoon these apples in and try to avoid any big gaps. We want to make sure that we can pile in as many apples as we can, building layers. This may seem like a lot of apples, and it is because you want them to bake down under that crumble topping. Now we can add the crumble topping, and this will also seem like a mountain of crumble topping, but again, it's going to bake down and be so delicious with all of these spiced apples. Our pie is ready for the oven. Bake the pie at 400 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes, then reduce the oven to 375 degrees for the remaining time. That initial blast of heat helps set and brown the crust, while the lower temperature lets the filling cook through evenly. Place a baking sheet on the rack below to catch any juices that may bubble over. After those first 20 minutes, I always add a pie crust shield or some foil to keep the edges from over browning. If you're ever unsure if your pie is done, look for the filling bubbling around the edges. That's your visual cue that it's ready. Or if you want to be exact, the filling should register around 200 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Now this is the hardest part, letting the pie cool for at least 3 hours before cutting into it. I know it smells incredible, but this time helps the filling set up so you can get those perfect tall slices instead of a runny mess. And then of course serve it with vanilla ice cream, maybe even a drizzle of salted caramel, because we don't mess around when it comes to desserts. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you feel inspired to try a new baking recipe today. Head over to my website for the full written recipe and all of my success tips. You can also ask a question right there on the recipe page, and my team and I will be happy to answer.